Okay, thank you so much for coming in. This is, of course, the most difficult session, the last one of the conference. But I would just like to extend the most heartfelt thanks to Andrew, who stepped in at the last minute to fill the slot. And Andrew is from Nokia and is going to be talking to us about emerging markets. Yes? Research in emerging markets.
Yes. Hey everyone, thank you for enjoying Psy in the background. I originally had a Psy reference in the deck, and I just cut it on the way here, and so I was like, I can't not have a talk about Psy this year, right? Like, the dude is so awesome. Did you know that he's signed up with Justin Bieber's manager? So get ready for a lot of Psy in English. And with that, Korean rapping in the background, basically, as soon as the dude starts rapping in English, he can have my money. Like, it's direct debit, just take it, just give me the rap. So, I want to talk to you about some lessons I learned about product making in emerging markets. So I'm a design researcher for Nokia in our mobile phones division, in mobile phones UX. So I'm part of a team that did the Asha smartphone range. So product like this. Actually, we are shortlisted for an Interactions Award in the disruption category. So if you know anyone on the jury, tweet them. And I think the obvious caveat here is that I'm not representing Nokia. I was only asked to do this talk on Thursday, so I've got only the most basic of approvals. So if I go off road, please don't get me into trouble. Naturally, these views are mine and not Nokia's. And I mean, in part that's because Nokia is such an enormously big organisation with so many different people involved that you can't even hope to represent what Nokia thinks about something. So in that context, this is my values for product making. This is why I'm a design researcher, because I want to make relevant, beautiful and successful things. And this is the framing that I'm going to put around the talk today. So there are kind of three fields that I'm going to be referring to on these objectives today. Relevant is obviously research, but more specifically anthropology. Beautiful is design, and successful, I think this is what I'm really interested in, is the commercial concerns of making successful products and making products. So in that context, for us here in London, for the few of us who aren't seeing Pat Jordan or Carolyn Jarrett, as I would be, why do emerging markets matter to us? So let's take a look at the commercial lens first. First of all, there is growth, and that is a scarcity in the world economy at the moment. There's really rapid growth in these countries. If you look at India, a bad year for... so this chart I started in 1991 because that was the year that India liberalised its economy, so it seemed as good a place as any to start. And a bad year for India in this time frame is equaling the UK and the US's growth rate, right? Most good years are 3 to 4% ahead, and then China is just scouring ahead. So you know, these two as examples of very popular and very, very large emerging markets have had enormous growth in this time period. And so if you're 50 or 60 and Indian or Chinese, you've seen in your lifetime an incredibly rapid increase in the standard of living. And that, you know, that's a really profound effect that I can only really imagine. And I think it's a really important part of the mentality of people in emerging markets is a rapid standard of growth that they've seen. Another point is new consumers. So this is Raja Biyapukar. I don't know if I got her name perfect, but she's a really influential market researcher in India, and she's written a lot of really excellent market research around how you target and ship products in emerging markets. And what she says is that, well, she points out the obvious, which is that economic growth brings people out of a point where they are making everything for themselves, everything they consume they're making for themselves or bartering. When economic growth comes and entrepreneurial opportunities arrive, then they start being able to buy products like soap or food, rather than making everything for themselves. So it's this, you know, very commercially viewed, but still radical change in their lives. And then the other point is there's enormous improvements in infrastructure that characterize economic development in emerging markets. So this is obviously physical infrastructure like trains in China especially, airports everywhere in emerging markets are blossoming, and roads as well. But also we can think about digital infrastructure like mobile data or home broadband, which are exploding and getting a lot more popular. And I think the interesting thing about mobile data is that it is cheap as well as more evident. So this, I took these photos in Bangalore in February, and you can't read it really, so you have to trust me, that 1 month of 2G data, so it is 2G not 3G, but 1 month for 2 gigabytes is 98 rupee. That's about £1.20. So it's affordable for a lot of people over there. And to put that in context, that's about half the price of a Bollywood movie. So, it's middle class and well below that are able to afford mobile data. So I've met people in India whose main entertainment sources are their TV and Facebook on their mobile phone. So, there's this kind of definitely their own patterns of technology adoption. And I think the final thing that's really salient from a commercial point of view about emerging markets is that they drive disruptive innovations. So this is the Tata Nano, and it's a disruptive innovation for a car for a lot of different reasons. It's incredibly cheap. It is aimed at people that current car manufacturers ignore, that as in motorcycle drivers who who are carrying their families around. That was the guy's vision for it. A two-wheeler with a guy driving a two-wheeler with his wife and kids on him, and that happens a lot. So he put this car out on the market that is only fractionally more expensive than a new two-wheeler. So it's the EasyJet of the car industry, and this is happening across, not just in car, but across all industries. And the mobile phone industry in particular is definitely getting disrupted by cheap Chinese manufacturers plus Android. So I think moving on from commercial things a little bit, there's another reason that emerging markets matter to us as designers is that they're tough. They're really challenging and rewarding. And I think for me, the understanding of people from other cultures and trying to come to some kind of description of their needs that they recognize is really personally challenging and satisfying. And when I started out at Nokia, it really felt like the big league, doing stuff like this, going into, this is Chinese respondent's house where he named David, and just having 3 hours hanging out with him and seeing what happened was really, really personally challenging, and it really, really turned me on in that sort of professional way. But it's not just the challenge, it is also the core nature of what design is. A friend of mine, Kat Goff, describes design as the translation of social need. And it's certainly true that when you go to foreign cultures, you find a lot of needs that are more interesting to you because they're new, so it can be a real attraction to solve other cultures' needs. And I think that then leads us on to what the Design Council says in its What is Design page, which is saying, well, come on, let's move on from what is design and what isn't design. And so the question isn't therefore so much what is design and why does it matter, but how can I use good design to make the world around me better? And it's really at the heart of the design project is changing the world around you for the better. And there's a lot of traction in the idea of making emerging markets a better place. One example of that is Open IDEO. So this is a separate foundation set up by IDEO where sponsors, and any sponsor, can nominate some kind of problem and then crowdsource an approach and a solution and the execution of that. So it's really successful and I like it a lot. I think there's a lot to be said that's good about it. And it also isn't solely focused on emerging markets, but emerging market projects come up that way. So this example, for instance, how might we identify and celebrate businesses that innovate for world benefit and inspire other companies to do the same? There is a strong feeling of the emerging market tactic in there. And also, crowdsourcing pulls people out of the woodwork, but this is designers giving their time for free. This is a common part of the design project. And so it is this mission of design is to make the world a better place. So the problem, this is where my training as an anthropologist starts kicking in, and the improving mentality is slightly problematic. Now, I've had only like the most basic of formal training as an anthropologist, but one thing that they do is they always take you on a tour of the dark history of anthropology. Yeah, which seems strange at the time, but then I'm going to take you guys on a little potted version of that. Yeah, because it's an educative process to learn, to see our current engagement with other cultures in the history of what anthropology had gotten up to, and what weighs really heavily on the kind of the soul of anthropology now. If you've ever been to an anthropology conference, you'll know what I mean. Anthropology originated, as a study of mankind, and it originated in the Victorian colonial era. It was put to work on the concerns of the day. The colonial possessions that Britain had acquired and many other colonial powers had acquired, and how best to govern them. So broadly speaking, the concerns of anthropology were the concerns of the government, how to make money, and how best to govern these foreign lands that Britain had. It managed its dependencies. So that quickly became, I'll get to that in a minute. You can see here that this is the Albert Memorial, and this is, Victoria was the paragon of the British Empire. The empire rose and fell with her reign, actually, and Albert as her consort. This was built in the middle of the empire, and the architecture of it perfectly reflects the colonial mentality. So we have the glowing king in the middle, surrounded by, I'm going to have to read this, surrounded by the 4 statues representing agriculture, commerce, engineering and manufacturing. They're the inner 4, and then on the outer 4 you have the 4 dominions of the empire: Africa, Asia, America and Europe. Because interestingly, Britain had colonies in Malta and a lot of Greece, and Cyprus, of course. So Europe was all fair game for the empire as well. So, the reading of this monument's pretty clear, that the glowing king's in the middle, then his tools of power, industry, commerce, etc., and then the domains and the resources that he's plundering on the outside. And then, as another example, we can see colonial preoccupations in the advertising. This is much later on, but still quite a colonial preoccupation. So we have the East African transport old style here. Does anyone want to take a guess what the new style is? If you guess it's a white man saving the day, you might be right. So, looking pretty noble, saving the savages from walking around by directing them to build roads. So this was the central justification that was given for empire, that it wasn't taking resources from civilizations around the world. It was that, but also primarily civilizing them and making them helping them because they needed it. So let me read to you from this book. This is Jan Morris, who wrote a history of the empire called Pax Britannia, and this is the first book, Heaven's Command. So she says, the conviction of empire was increasingly reinforced by a sense of duty and became quite heavily veneered with religiosity. The Victorians were believers. They believed in their Christian master, in their providential destiny, in their servants of steam and steel, in their systems, and not least in their empire. As the mysteries of life were unfolded to them explicitly in the triumphs of applied science, opaquely in the intellectual conception like survival of the fittest, so their one particular place in the divine scheme seemed ever more specific. They were called to be the great improvers. So, and to continue reading from Morris, we read of natives awaiting redemption, of Christianity's guiding beacon. The Indian territories were allotted by Providence to Great Britain, wrote Charles Grant, that we might diffuse among their inhabitants, long sunk in darkness, vice and misery, the light and benign influence of the truth, the blessings of well-regulated society. So this is a really clear message, and there are thousands of quotes in this book that I could have picked, but it's clear that in the colonies they found darkness, vice and misery, and they needed to bring the light and benign influence of truth. So as an Australian, I would have loved to have quoted you what people thought of the Australian colonies. Certainly Certainly they thought that my ancestors were sunk in darkness, vice and misery as well. Maybe not the worst thing in the world. But, you know, these are really horrendous attitudes that were taken. You know, they were really offensive and shaped a lot of the political problems that people see. So just one more quick example to take it back to anthropology. So there was a debate in the 1800s about whether Homo sapiens were one species or multiple species. So the guy on the right, Ernst Haeckel, argued that we were multiple species, so we weren't all just one Homo sapiens. But then furthermore, that multiple species could be subdivided into races, and that then those races were quite obviously could be ordered in terms of how civilized they were. So where Caucasian was the highest and most advanced race, and then there were primitives at the bottom which were doomed to extinction. So that was a really common conception at the time, the ordering of races and the superiority of one race to another. And that was anthropology, you know, it was people applying the Enlightenment and the rational process. So Darwin is here just to illustrate that it wasn't only freaks at the time that thought it. Darwin, he did believe that there was only one species of man, which makes him somewhat liberal in this light, but he still contrasted civilized races with savage races. So these ideas, these really horrible ideas, came about, were justified by the Enlightenment, and I think are still bubbling around today. So this is kind of the hazing that anthropologists get when they start learning, is these sins happened, these wrong thoughts happened in our field, and to be part of the field you need to now understand this and see your contribution in the perspective of not making these mistakes again. So there are these kind of basic the colonial errors, I've called them, that there's a fundamental difference between us and them, that I have more things and better morals, so I'm superior. I can judge them according to my standards. I can see what they need, and most importantly of all, they need our help. So this is the obvious point in the presentation where I'm going to show you some stuff about people in emerging markets doing just fine by themselves. So this one about the OLPC laptop, which is called NES, that kids apparently hacked. They left some there with no instructions, and kids hacked in and unlocked the camera and all this cool stuff. And then this other one that just went around the other day, so some teenage girls in Africa who invented a urine-powered generator. So it is quite clear, and I hope obviously it's self-evident to all of us, that people in emerging markets don't need our help. You know, they're pretty good at solving the problems that are around them. They're as talented designers as we are. And so I think really clearly for me, my talk, it's not about them, it's about us, and it's about the assumptions and stereotypes that we carry around and take to the field. And I really want to help us challenge ourselves to see things more clearly. So I think to take it where anthropology took it now, as researchers our mission is to see the world as our participants see it. So see the problems that they see and see the benefits that they see and the joy that they see, and actively monitor our own perspective as it interferes with this as our central mission. So this is the core of anthropology then, this critical skill reflexivity. And this is your source of authority when you're in the field. You know you've seen something because you were in a situation, you had a personal reaction, you found out what that reaction was, and then you overcame it, and then came to a deeper truth that ideally your participant agrees with. So this is the core muscle of anthropology, is using this reflexive skill and applying it to everything we see. So I want to come back to the purpose of my talk today, which is about making relevant, beautiful and successful products. And I took that detour into racist history just because it helps us see certain ideas as not useful anymore. So I want to explore some of those colonial errors, and the first one is I can see what they need. So this is a concept that Adaptive Path put together, a mobile device concept for rural India. So this was a few years old, and I'm using this concept as a surrogate for a lot of the ideas that I've seen at Nokia internally. There's a lot of people start out with ideas that don't really stand up to the kind of scrutiny that I'm about to give this one. So to be fair to Adaptive Path, I'm very grateful that they did this because it's public and I can use it. This was, this is a marketing piece for them. This is them trying to attract some attention. But again, it's relevant because this happens in more commercially focused endeavors. So basically, what they found was that text-based UIs were not suitable for illiterate users. Abstract metaphors like SMS were also unsuitable because SMS uses an envelope, and if you don't have a postal address, you don't send mail, so how would you know what an envelope is? Instead, what is familiar in terms of technology is stuff like you can still see with the car. Physical interface elements like dials, buttons, and information gauges are more familiar. Mechanical world metaphors are more familiar in that context as well. So most technology in rural India separates controls from information, meaning it isn't an interactive screen, it is a DVD remote or something. Reselling and repair is very common, which is very true. And the vast majority of phones' features are untouched by non-literate users, creating this kind of bloated feature set. So that was their research findings. The next step for them was taking a creative position, which is a great thing to do. So they found steampunk as a useful creative direction, reflecting the design. Then these are their words: reflects the design and craftsmanship of the Victorian era. So already it's kind of on dodgy ground. But also one thing that was interesting was removing the aesthetic of preciousness to invite tinkering and exploration to help enhance this repair culture. So this is the concept that they ended up with at the end. So you can see sort of one button, one option, big microphone because sound's important, easy invitation to sort of pop the hood. I mean, this is just a concept, I don't think there's anything in there, but this would somehow make it more maintainable. Stop-start buttons and a scroll wheel to sort of leverage off radio and playing and Walkmans. Then big gauges for battery level, an airtime indicator and a big speaker. And then this is mostly the same ideas, it's just got a keypad that folds out. So what I kind of want to explore is how they ended up here, and at Nokia we ended up here. How we got to these different places. And if I was taking Adaptive Path really to town on this, I would have to be a lot fairer and say we targeted different people, etc., etc. But these are really, really radically different assumptions that we're making about our target users in emerging markets here. So the first fallacy I want to discuss is that cultures are frozen in a certain point in time. So this is this idea that you can go to rural India or China or Brazil or wherever, and you can observe the culture. And then if things seem generally less developed, then it is because they are less developed. And one of the great mistakes to make here is if you go to rural India and you find open sewers and smelly stuff and butchers not using refrigeration, you mentally project their society back to Western society when we were at that stage, the 1800s or whenever, or 1600s or whenever. And then you think, well, that's the process of development of society. And you go forward, so you kind of lock them in that place. And that prioritizes the differences that we have between cultures. You just go there and you just look at differences. And I think that something a little bit closer is that the world plays out in real time. So that, like I've already mentioned, people have a TV and a mobile phone, but not regular electricity. Or in this case, what Raja Bijan Kapoor says is that our faith in astrology does not decrease because of the rising levels of scientific education. Instead, we move effortlessly to computerized horoscopes. And why wouldn't you? Like you've got this screen and you want to know what your horoscope is, go for it. So people eagerly adopt new technology when it suits their lives, and this can look uneven to us from our development. I think the second thing is that they need basic products, or to put it a slightly different way, their needs are defined by what they lack. So if we look again at what is needed here, ways to manage literacy, help repairing and maintaining devices, simple features and technology that feels appropriate and familiar was a big theme as well. And we can easily just cast these into lacks. So the lack of ability to read, lack of safe environments and the ability to replace phones instead of having to repair them, lacking ability to understand complex things, and lacking the confidence to try new things. So all of these things are missing low-level needs, you know, lacking confidence, lacking security, lacking ability to read. And if we look at good old Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we can see they're all right at the bottom, basically. They're all kind of safety needs. And I think, you know, a lot of the other stuff that's thrown around emerging market users is even physiological needs, like getting stuff to market and, you know, identifying food safety, although that is a big thing in China. So this kind of implies that we then think that higher order needs aren't important to people in emerging markets. So, and that's a really, really big mistake. That's a huge mistake. And in particular, I think Chip Heath, who's a social psychologist who wrote, he and his brother wrote Made to Stick, and he argues that a basic mistake in designing communications or motivating people is that we assume other people are motivated by lower order needs, but we are motivated by esteem and higher order needs. And so everyone goes around thinking, I'm the only one that cares about my self-esteem, everyone else just cares about money and food. So two examples then. Back to the Tata Nano, it is an insanely cheap car. It's got radically reduced feature set, if you want to call it that. So it's got no AC, it had no radio, no seatbelt. At least I only saw the first model, I haven't seen this one. And of course the size, it is tiny, it is a fridge on very, very small wheels. But from a styling point of view, it makes no concessions to being a cheap car. I mean, from the look of it, this car lacks for nothing. It's just small and dinky. Whereas I don't know what the build was quite plasticky, but there's certainly nothing that the designers of it haven't thought was aspirational about it. And I think it's this thing of just because you're buying a cheap car doesn't mean you don't care about how you look, or let alone that you actually want to look cheap. Yeah, so if you're in the market for the cheapest car ever, why would you want to look cheap? You know, you would still want to look cool. And the other point is that we actually live in multiple cultures. So the advent of advertising, TV, and the internet means that you're exposed to, you know, the rest of the world is playing out in real time, like I've said. So this is product placement in a Bollywood movie. It's called The Bodyguard. It was not a remake, I'm sorry to say, of Whitney Houston's Finest Moment. But it was renowned for product placement. So we have Audi, we've got Vio, and interestingly, the big Hollywood star who played the bodyguard apparently refused any offers from other security firms for him to work for them in the movie. He instead showed loyalty to his bodyguard, and who works for Tiger, so he works for Tiger in the movie. So, you know, so these images through movies and TV and the internet are available widely. You know, even if they're not attainable, they're still your definition of what looks good. You know, so again, we get blinded when we go to exotic cultures, that we only see the differences. We don't see that they're still watching Gwyneth Paltrow, or that in the Korean soaps that are popular in China, they're all using Samsung Galaxy tabs, even if they, you know, even if they're not affordable to them. So basically, emerging market consumers know what the good products are, and they want, and they know what the best Western brands are, and why should they want anything less for themselves? So, you know, it goes back to that phone. It's sort of like rich guys get phones without big dials and that don't sort of pop open and look instantly repairable. So why should I? Why, you know, they talked about avoiding the fear of preciousness. It's like, well, why shouldn't I get precious things? You know, if I don't have, just because I don't have as much money as the guy actually buying the iPhone or the Lumia 920. Yeah, there's the pleasure that you get. There's a real pleasure in buying things that reflect how you want your life to be, not how it is around you. And this is another mistake that we make. We go into a situation and we want to design stuff that reflects our view of the situation. And if I were working hard and very poor in India, I would want something awesome. I would only want to spend my money on the very best thing I could, and it better look awesome. So the basic learning, the way I'd reframe it is, cool to be cool, right? Or, alternatively, self-esteem is a very powerful emotion. So, you know, we should we should remember that our users want self-esteem as well. So some other examples are, in 2008 at least, there were more colour televisions in India than there were toilets. And also, a logic is, once you've bought your second-hand car or a refrigerator, there's such visible signs of status that why would you continue buying branded shampoo and conditioner when everyone around you who you wanted to know that you have money and you bought something nice and cool, well, then that's it. So it's just this, you know, if you were in their shoes, which styling would you prefer? Would you want something that was kind of retro and funky and hipsterish? I wouldn't. I mean, this is the one thing an Indian guy said to me when we were researching a retro concept is, we haven't had technology. I mean, this guy had an MBA, right? Let's not, he was pretty well off. But he said, we haven't had technology in India long enough to get funny about it. We just want good stuff. We don't need, you know, we're not sick of it yet. So I think this is one other important point, because aspiration is a common theme when we talk about emerging market consumers. And the really important thing with aspiration is that it's not dreaming, it's doing. Sure, people dream. Sure, people imagine being in Hollywood movies that they've got no chance of. But an interesting fact is that 90% of rural Indian households are led by someone who's self-employed. So that makes them fast adopters of any productivity tool like mobile phones or motorbikes that can help them earn more. So don't, you know, when I show you images like this, don't just think Gossip Girl. You know, think it's a much more broad application. An really interesting challenge for us that I haven't sorted out for myself is that the fallacy is that usability is universally important. And I don't think it is. I've certainly heard enough stories from Asia, at least, about people buying expensive things that they don't know how to use. So a friend of mine is Korean, and her parents buy the most expensive Samsung smartphone whenever it's around, and then they will go to classes put on by Samsung to teach you how to use it. So it's a total inverse, you know, it's a total inverse of our understanding of why you would buy technology. We want a technology that fits our lives, and they sort of see it as a new potential. So it goes back to that thing I was saying, is the radical standards of living increase means that the present's so much better than the past. So, you know, the future is going to be so much better again, and it works both ways. It's that there are opportunities to be grabbed, but also, I think we found this with middle-aged people especially, you better keep up as well, because if you don't keep up, then your kids are going to kind of be a bit ashamed of you, or you'll be the uncool person. So another story my Korean colleague told me is that she volunteered to teach silver surfers. I've got an email here. Yeah, the Silver Net, where you volunteer to teach internet to the old, retired people, 60 plus. So, and it was really, she was curious about why people who were retired wanted to use the internet, because it was about 10 years ago, so they didn't need it for work. So what was pushing them? And it wasn't just that they wanted to play bridge online, or they wanted to catch up with friends, or there was a Korean version of Facebook for retired people. It's really interesting. They just paid, you know, in a multi-generation household, they paid a monthly fee for the internet. The grandparents, they saw their kids and their grandkids using it at night after work, after school, and so they just saw it being unused during the day, and so they thought, well, this is a resource that I'm not fulfilling, so I should just go and learn how to use it then. It's like having hot water for the first time and thinking, well, there must be soups I can make with hot water or something, you know. So yeah, they taught them web browsing and email, and they did mostly end up playing online card games, which is maybe not which is a strange end to the story. But I think it goes back to what I've already said, which is, in a rapidly changing society, keeping up to date is really important. You know, this is a really radically different product value that people bring. It is about power, it's not about simplicity or usability. And to be honest, it's a challenge that I've never figured out the answer to, when I have Western designers being presented with what Chinese people want from a internet browser. It's mind-boggling. You know it's a challenge I haven't yet resolved. At the moment, there just seems to be Chinese people making their own browsers. And this is my big takeaway, I think, is that your users want to be smarter, sexier, and richer. So just help them. You know, like I don't think. You know, I think there's a really wide political argument to be made about engagement in emerging markets. But from my perspective about making cool things, I mean, that's it in a way. So I'll just quickly revisit the big picture now about the great improvers. And the other main thread, to get more practical, is about us making assumptions about them. And that, again, this assumption that we can judge them by our standards, or alternatively that they're so different for us. So another fallacy is that they're not rational. You know, they're this magical, mystical other that we can't understand. And I have to say, it can be really weird to interview people from a foreign culture. I mean, you know, it can be weird meeting anyone, but some of the stuff I've heard, I had a greatest hits. So we met this guy in China. We were talking about the environment. I'm really worried about the environment, so I take my four-wheel drive off-roading to Tibet to enjoy the environment before it's ruined. And it's just like, that's awesome. Like, what are you talking about? We were hoping that he would say stuff like, yes, so it's really important, bioplastics. I know what bioplastics are, and I would pay more for a phone that I could recycle it, or whatever. And he was just in a different spot entirely. So that was, I mean, I never figured that one out, but this one's a good one as well. We were looking at text message preview on phones. So I don't like the preview of, I had to take out the bit of the prototype we were testing, but the text message preview came down like it does on, say, Android. And I don't like this preview. I don't want people knowing what kind of messages I get. And so I said, so do you put a password on your phone? And she was like, no, I don't want anyone thinking I have something to hide. And it's a bit like, well, make up your mind. Like, do you want security or not? You know, you can stop people seeing that, or you can leave it open. You know, we've given you a tool. And after feeling that, I thought about it a bit more. And what the technique that I use is to explain any novel or weird or unusual behavior as a rational response to a different environment. So what that Chinese guy said about the environment is a puzzle that we have to solve rationally, and I don't have the answer. But this is another one. It's like whenever you think a user has contradicted themselves, what it really means is that you haven't understood the situation properly. So I'll dig into privacy now. And there's a central contradiction in privacy, is that phones are private objects because they've got your text, your email, your call log, your voicemail. If I steal your phone, I basically can be you on Facebook. I can get you in all kinds of trouble. Also, pictures are really private. So there's this really, you know, it's a really private and precious thing. But they're also social objects. So especially in emerging markets, new phones are a talking point. You wanna try it out. It's a big deal. Users lend phones to each other for games, or especially if you're the person that's got mobile internet, you kind of want to help your friends and be seen to help your friends by giving them the mobile internet so they can check whatever, their email or whatever. I did find people that when we asked them to log into email had to log out of their friend's email on their phone first. And then also just at the cognitive level, flashing lights on in a social environment when a notification goes off, our lizard brain engages, and we look at it before we really know what's going on, and then we just try and drag our attention away. So, you know, we've got these different competing pressures going on that I think actually are driving what that woman was talking about, and so we can kind of flip those into needs or desires. So just help me avoid embarrassment. Don't let my dodgy pictures that aren't that bad, but you know, I still don't want my mum to see. You know, help me out with that stuff. Don't let my mushy note from my other half show up in the business meeting when I'm using my phone. But the other thing is I basically trust my friends. I want to help them, but so I don't want to be the douchebag who locks down their entire phone. But you know, it's certainly not 100% trust. And so I think I took out the rest because I thought it might be a bit I didn't want to get in trouble. But then this opens up new design approaches. So we could look at this idea of privacy as something slightly more porous, not like a security model, not on or off, but something where we can just help the user avoid any embarrassing situations without going to town. So maybe we have a setting that just lets you say whether or not you put the preview on. I think most phones probably do that anyway. Maybe we don't, in the email, we stop showing previews at the root level. So, you know, when you've got all of your email inboxes, you can see who it's from and maybe the subject, but not the text. Just to put a little bit more effort in between getting there and then getting the private content. Not to put barriers, but just to, if someone's really snooping, then we're not going to stop them, but it'll help you and your friend avoid awkward situations. So then the two basic questions now, the super practical end, in the toolkit for reflexivity. So a really good thing to do before you go out to field is have an exercise where you gather all your field workers together and say, what do we expect to find when we go out there? So this doesn't have to be international, this could be anywhere. And it feels weird, and researchers would often resist it until they get the full picture, because like, well, I don't know yet, I don't have any opinions. But if you just, you know, expunge what you think you might find, then when you come back, you can be a bit more aware of your assumptions and see how they played out. And then one really interesting question is, at the end of every designer researcher interview I always gave, well, the designers always had a sheet where they, 2 sides of A4, where they just made notes. There's kind of like a homework thing. And one question I always included in there was, what does this person want from their phone that you don't want from your phone? Just to really amplify it and just to put the finger on that one pressure point about, so they're different from you, right? And let's capture exactly what it was. Because it is only natural, like my reaction with the make up your mind. You know, you get judgmental when you can't understand what people are about. So it's just about capturing that. So I think what I was hoping for the talk overall was just to see that we could see our actions in a little bit more historical perspective and use that to sort of broaden our understanding of the scope of our activities, and then sort of use some successful tools. And then I'll leave you with a sexy product. Thank you.
Does anybody have any questions for Andrew?
Yeah, in Japan, you have your own like technological platforms, and people design. They don't even rely on Western agencies or companies, let's say, design their products or interfaces. And do you think like India and China will kind of get to that point as well, rather than, you know, us from Western agencies kind of designing for them?
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you think as they're getting more economically powerful?
I think there's a lot of great design happening in India and China already. It's harder to find because we're not plugged into the circuit, but I think especially if you look at things like labs like Spice Mobile in India. Spice are kind of like a Virgin brand, they do a lot of different things. But Spice Labs are just this bunch of, we've met them in Bangalore, this bunch of guys that are just rattling out apps. They've got making a lot of money on Hangman, you know. So I don't know that they're revolutionizing anything, but there are millions of engineers in India and China building a lot of things. I think if we're talking about high-end design quality, that is potentially somewhere that I haven't seen their output be as competitive, but I think that's just a matter of time. Yeah.
James?
Yes, please.
It was really interesting to me to see the contrast between the slide you showed about how transport used to be in East Africa and how the white vans improved it.
Yeah.
And a little bit later on you talked about product placement of essentially Western brands in media across the whole of the world. Do you not think that the latter is just another example before?
Yeah. Yeah, and there's a really strong argument that capitalism is the new colonialism, in that we're turning all these people into consumers of Western technology. I mean, in the really specific instance of my political activity within Nokia, or my status at Nokia politically, if Nokia stopped making phones, then Chinese people, the Chinese manufacturers would eat that market right up, you know. So from that perspective, is happening, you know, and any one individual action is not going to be able to address that. But I think, yeah, consumerism is winning. Yeah.
Anybody else? Zachary?
I was just curious about, you know, you were pretty damning of some of the conclusions that Rachel and Adaptive Path had made.
Yeah.
Those were about 4 years ago now.
Mm-hmm.
But then you also talked about how there's this radical kind of, like this pace of change is so intense.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious, I mean, steampunk concept aside, because
yeah.
I agree with you that it seems a little off the mark. But do you think that maybe 4 years ago some of the insights that you would have might be more aligned to kind of some of the things that Rachel ultimately kind of outlined?
So whether the market's moved on a little bit?
Well, I mean, yeah, absolutely. Like, do you think the 4 years is a long time
Yeah.
in kind of modern India or China, having
Yeah.
spent time in both places? I mean, literally, you go to a neighborhood and it's like it was a slum, you know, a year ago, and now it's, you know,
Yeah.
it's completely redone. And
Yeah,
there's
yeah,
a lot
yeah.
of bad and good in that. But I'm just curious, like, you know, about did you actually think of that time gap? 4 years is actually a big time right now.
I was drawing on the research that I did in 2009. So we tested a retro concept in 2009, and that went, no one in India liked the idea of that.
Yeah. So but like I said, concept aside, the findings.
No, I think I would still criticise it, saying you can't make appealing consumer products by focusing on what people lack.
Yeah.
And I don't think it got in the head of those. You know, they looked at illiterate users, which is one decision, and I never read anything that wrote up that made me think that it got inside their head at all, or that they had come across anything that they would actually want in their lives. It felt like an art project responding to some ethnography, but you know, I never felt like the Indian voice was in the design at all.
Yeah, it's just weird that you say the Indian voice again. Like, that is a massively diverse culture. Maybe I'm belaboring this too much, but it could be actually a good set of insights for a certain market. Because if you actually look at the piece, it's a lot about rural India. And if you look at the product of the time that's kind of doing the best, is the Nokia 1100.
Yeah,
I happen to know a lot about that stuff. And interestingly enough, Rachel was lead researcher for Nokia for multiple years. After that. So at any rate, I'll catch up with you later and chat about it.
Yeah, definitely.
Any more questions?
Yeah, I really like the tone and content of your whole piece, and I'm just wondering, you know, I work in a very corporate environment. Are they quite open to your ideas, which I thought were cool, but pretty radical in some ways as well, because it makes people challenge their cultural blinders? Are people open to it?
I don't lecture people on racism.
Not racism necessarily.
I just go to town on what I think about ideas.
Okay.
And when you make it about the product, when you make it about the product or the content, then the ferocity often, any energy you put in is often appreciated.
Okay, yeah. So I didn't think the racism thing, more the fact that, you know, people's cultural assumptions in general, you know, and like the way they actually cognitively process things. So in, let's say, the corporate environment, they are comfortable being changed?
I think people want to learn, and people know that they don't know, so they don't, you know, I think a lot of the errors I see, you know, the attribution errors, are first off, first goes, and you can you know, you can just sort of work with them and educate them. And ironically, you know, I've learned a lot from people in fast-moving consumer goods, so Nestle, Kit Kat, Colgate, that kind of stuff. I'm working with Indian and Chinese market researchers with that background, because they're all over this. You know, they've long ago given up. They've long ago figured out how to sell stuff.
Fantastic. Thank you very, very much, Amy.